Welcome to Book Club with David Sachs. I'm absolutely thrilled to have one of the world's leading experts on international relations and one of the most important voices in public affairs in the world today. With me, Professor John Mearsheimer, also a good friend and somebody that I admire tremendously. Professor Mearsheimer has a very important new book, co-authored with Sebastian Rosado, who is a professor at University of Notre Dame, and Professor Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor at the University of Chicago. I'm sure that most or all of you have been listening to John Mearsheimer discuss the events around the war in Ukraine and now wars in the Middle East and so many other issues, because he's been the go-to person for so much of the world in trying to make sense of the multiple crises that we're in and the spread of violence. One of John's truly justifiably famous books is The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which was written at the start of the new century. And in that book, he said that it seems a little quiet now, but don't worry, or worry maybe I should say, great power politics will return. And the book's title that I'm going to discuss with you, John, also is about the tragedy of great power politics, and we seem to have a lot of tragedy to go around right now. But the new book that you've written is, of course, completely relevant for our current struggles and trials and tribulations globally. It's about how states think, and the gist of the book is about whether state decision-making is rational or irrational and what difference it makes. You started writing this during COVID, during the lockdown, so this is a book that you and Sebastian Rosado wrote, as I understand it, largely on Zoom together during the first couple of years of the pandemic, but it became absolutely pressingly relevant in trying to understand the Ukraine war. So maybe if we could start, you could explain the motivation for this book. You're known as our nation's leading realist thinker in international relations, so it would be good to help listeners understand how you fit into the story and your views about this. But what's the motivation of writing a book called How States Think?
Well, there is a widespread perception in the academic world and in the policy world that states, in terms of their foreign policy behavior, are irrational or non-rational. And our view was that if that is the case, most of our theories in international relations about how the world works are largely irrelevant, because all of those theories are based on the rational actor assumption. Then we also said to ourselves that if you're a policymaker and you think that states are irrational, how can you possibly formulate some sort of coherent policy? Because you have no idea what other states are going to do, because they're basically irrational. They're wild and crazy. And our intuition, in fact, our theories about how the world works, say that states are rational. So what we decided to do was try to figure out whether states are routinely rational or routinely non-rational. And to do that, you have to have a definition of what rationality is, because that has to be the baseline that you then employ to look at past state behavior and determine whether or not states have been rational or not. So what we do in the book is we explore what rationality is, and then we look at the historical record, and we conclude, one might say unsurprisingly, that states are rational most of the time. This is not to say that they don't do irrational things, and a good example of that would be George W. Bush invasion of Iraq in 2003. That was clearly, in our opinion, a case of non-rationality.
So we'll come to that to understand that. But in our current discourse, for example, it has been said almost nonstop. Well, Putin, he's irrational. He thinks he's Peter the Great. He's aiming in an illusion to rebuild the Russian Empire. And your argument is, no, this is not a serious way to think about Russia's decision-making or President Putin's role in Russia's decision-making. And if we think that way, we're ourselves going to be led down a very dangerous and inaccurate path in how we deal with the global challenges.
Yeah, let me say a few words about Putin, because there's no question that that's the case that almost everybody rivets on these days. Our basic argument is that whether a state is rational or not is largely a function of the theories that underpin the policy that a leader is pursuing. And in other words, if a statesman or a leader has a cockamamie theory that informs the state's policy, then that's not rational. And if you look at the case of Vladimir Putin, this is a pretty straightforward case of Putin and virtually every Russian leader being deeply fearful of NATO expansion. And when it was first announced in April 2008 that Ukraine was going to become part of NATO, the Russians made it unequivocally clear that this was unacceptable, and Putin was in the lead in making that argument. Nevertheless, NATO continued to move eastward and to attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. And the end result is a major crisis broke out in February 2014, and then you had the war where Putin or the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. And our argument is that this is a straightforward case of balance of power politics. It's Realpolitik 101. What Putin was doing was balancing against the West. He was balancing against NATO. It's hardly surprising that this conflict has broken out. But many people who are in the war party, and of course this includes huge numbers of people in the foreign policy establishment, believe that he is a mindless imperialist, and anybody who would dare to invade Ukraine for purposes of conquering it and incorporating it into a greater Russia has to be irrational. But that's not what he was doing, right? What he was doing was balancing against NATO. And this is a perfectly rational strategy. And we should have understood that from the get-go. And the fact that we didn't is quite remarkable.
And one of the pieces of evidence strongly in favor of your view is the memo that William Burns wrote in 2008 from his position as then ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's now the CIA director, but he wrote a memo back to the Secretary of State explaining it's not just Putin against the NATO expansion to Ukraine. It's the entire Russian political class. And so it's a complete opposite to the kind of claim that's made that there's some delusional leader. Burns spelled it out very clearly in I think the memo's entitled, "Niet means niet. No means no." Now, interestingly, John, just to ask you about that, that memo would never have seen the light of day, most likely, but for WikiLeaks. It was leaked in part of a treasure trove of foreign policy documents. So much of what states do, especially the U.S., I would say, and other big powers, is secret. So how does one assess this the real decision making, what people really believe, and how states are acting?
Well, the truth is that it's very tricky to do uh, in real time. And when you talk about Putin and exactly what his thinking was, it is not easy to put your finger on exactly what is going on. It's much easier to look at historical cases where you have a rich record and you can see what the documents and the memoirs and so forth and so on say about a particular set of leaders and what they were thinking. But I would argue in the Russian case, it's a pretty straightforward instance of a leader and his lieutenants, apropos the Bill Burns memo, saying over and over how they thought about NATO expansion and what they were going to do. There's no mystery here.
It wasn't subtle.
No, it's actually quite remarkable. What's remarkable is that the West paid hardly any attention. Maybe should say no attention to what Putin and his lieutenants were saying. They completely ignored the Bill Burns memo. And I would imagine that once we get our hands on the historical documents, all the historical documents, we'll see that Burns was not the only one who was telling people at the top of the Bush administration that this was what was going to happen.
So it does seem to me that Russia's response to this relentless push of NATO or of the U.S. to have NATO, a U.S.-led military alliance, expand was rational. But maybe to get to that, if you could explain what you and Sebastian Rosato mean by the term rational, because it is a loaded or a debated and unclear term. How do you operationalize that? And since we're talking also not about an individual decision or an individual person who could be rational or delusional and so forth, but rather a state. What is a state in this context specifically, and how would you assess whether the state is acting in a rational way?
Yeah, this is a great question. Let me just quickly lay out my definition, or my and Sebastian's definition of rationality, and then answer your question head on. Our argument is that rationality has two dimensions to it. First is the individual, and then there's the collectivity or the state, because as you point out, you can't just focus on one individual because decisions are made by a handful of people. There's surely a leader like Putin, but Putin is surrounded by other people who have input. So it's a collective decision or a state decision. And our argument is that at the individual level, what's imperative for rationality is for individuals to have a credible theory about how the world works that underpins their view of policy. We believe that human beings are fundamentally theoretical animals. We call this Homo theoreticus.
I like that, by the way. Yes.
Right. And that when you, Jeff Sachs, think about, what economic policy should be in Washington, you think about the world as an individual in terms of theories about how the world works. You have these economic theories. And when you look at international relations, you have political theories that inform your thinking. But that's just the individual level. Then there's the collective level, right? And our argument is you're often going to run into situations where you have different individuals who have different theories and therefore favor different policies. And to get a collective decision, to get a state policy, what you have to do in our story is have a deliberative decision-making process. You can't have a process that looks like the one before the Iraq War, where Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld suppressed all sorts of conflicting views or views that they didn't like. You have to have a robust and coherent decision-making process. And we argue in the Russian case that that's what happened. As you know, the conventional wisdom in the West is that Putin was isolated and that he made this decision to invade Ukraine all by himself. And there were all these people who disagreed with him, but he exiled them or he didn't listen to them. And it's the fact that he was a lone ranger that makes this irrational. This is wrong, we believe. And in fact, to go back to the Bill Burns memo, the Bill Burns memo makes it clear that Putin was not a loner here, that virtually everybody at the top of the foreign policy establishment in Russia agreed with Putin about NATO expansion. So our argument is, at the individual level, what you had is a set of Russian leaders, including Putin, of course, who were operating on the basis of balance of power theory, right? And therefore had a credible policy, right? And at the collective level, they agreed on what had to be done to deal with the problem. They believed, to a person, I think, that, and the Bill Burns memo confirms this, that NATO expansion into Ukraine had to be stopped. And the end result is that on February 24th, 2022, we got a war.
And, I think one of the telling documents, again, that really supports your view is the readout, or even it's almost verbatim minutes of the Russian Security Council meeting. I think it's February 21st, 2022. Yes. Is that right? Yes. That basically, it's a very organized meeting, and President Putin lays out the issue. What shall we do, colleagues? And then he calls on Lavrov, the foreign minister, and then he calls on other experts. Then he calls on people from the regions. And you get a full readout. We very rarely get that from the United States documents because these things are kept secret. I think the Russians wanted this to be understood. But it's actually a very orderly deliberation, and it obviously reflects a lot of orderly processes that repeated it. It's not one person. It's not President Putin pounding the table and say, we must do this. Quite the contrary. Lavrov explains, we made this entreaty to, this approach to the U.S., but they sent back a document on such and such date saying they would not negotiate over NATO, and then the next one gives another answer, the next one gives another answer, and then the meeting is summed up by the president. But it's a very deliberative, orderly process that no doubt you get the feel reflects a lot of orderly attention to high-stakes issues, but actually through a deliberative process.
Jeff, can I just jump in here and reflect on one of the insights from our book? A lot of people believe that when it comes to collective decision-making, when you're at the state level, there's a difference between how authoritarian states and democracies operate. And almost everybody we talk to in the West believes that democracies believe in deliberation. But authoritarian states are the opposite. And what you have is one leader who runs roughshod over everybody else. And this, of course, fits with the conventional wisdom on Putin. He doesn't listen to anybody. He decides what to do. And then anybody who disagrees gets sent to the gulag, and anybody who agrees gets promoted. So you have all these yes men and yes women who are operating under him. This is the way many people in the West think. Our view in looking at all these cases, and we looked at 14 cases in great detail, is that there's no difference between authoritarian states and democracies. In both cases, both sets of cases, you get a small number of people at the very top who make collective decisions. And what you discover in almost every case is when people are trying to formulate policies about grand strategy or how to deal with a particular crisis, what you see is that nobody, including the leader, is really sure what to do. And they're kind of searching around in the dark, trying to figure out what the best policy is. Therefore, leaders are prone to listen to their lieutenants about what might be a really good idea. If you take Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel today, whatever you think of Benjamin Netanyahu, he is in real trouble. The Israelis are in real trouble, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with Hamas. I am absolutely certain that Netanyahu is listening to anybody who he thinks might have a good idea about how to proceed. And someone like Naftali Bennett, who he might have terrible relations with otherwise, is a very smart man. And I'm sure that someone like Netanyahu will listen to Bennett just because Netanyahu is not sure what to do. And if Bennett has a good idea, he'll take that good idea and run with it. So my bottom line here is I don't think that Putin's behavior is any different in this authoritarian state, which Russia is, than would be the case if Russia were a democracy. You, in each case, have a small number of people at the top who make decisions and have a vested interest across the board in listening to others' ideas.
I think, I that really comports with my perception also of China, which is very institutionalized, very bureaucratic. It's been an administrative state for 2,000 years with a lot of discussion, a lot of deliberation, not one person calling any shots at all, but actually really collective decision-making in exactly that way. And I wonder, in a way, there is an irony that sometimes happens in our democracy. I have a feeling, let me ask you about this, many of the decisions that are taken absolutely against or with no interest in American public opinion, though in our, self-assessment, democracy also means reflecting the will of the people. But on many of these issues, the people are not asked, they're told, or they're ignored. But often it happens that to get some decision made in foreign policy in our ostensibly public-driven process, the public is lied to about the real situation on the battlefield, or lied to about the real reason for going to war, and so forth. And so maybe there's even more secrecy and less deliberation in the democratic setting in some cases, because you don't speak the truth. I mean, the lead up to the Iraq War was a desire of a small group to have a war to overthrow Saddam Hussein on pretextual reasons that turned out to be completely false, maybe even more false than they believed. But certainly they were not very much interested in the evidence that they were purporting to give to the American people. So it was a deception. And because of the deception, I'm just wondering whether maybe the deliberation is even cut short in such context, because too much talk, too much deliberation lets too much of the public in, and they didn't want to let the public in.
Yeah, let me directly address this issue, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about. First of all, in the book that Sebastian and I have written on how states think, what we discovered is that public opinion, what the public thinks, domestic politics, and so forth and so on, matters hardly at all in the decision-making process. The elites, a small number of elites, get together and they make the decision. We were actually surprised by this finding. We didn't go in thinking that this was a question we should address, how much domestic politics matters. But we discovered in looking at 14 cases and looking in a cursory way at a lot of other cases that domestic politics doesn't matter. That's point one. Point two is there's no
question. It's amazing. It's a stunning finding and a very important one.
Yes. And again, it wasn't one that we went in asking about, a question we went into the book asking about. Okay. Second point is that if you are in a democracy and you make a particular decision, you have to sell it to the public. There's no question about that. That's not as necessary in an autocracy. It's not to say it's completely unnecessary, because public opinion does matter somewhat, but it's definitely necessary in a democracy. Now, I wrote an earlier book called Why Leaders Lie. And the principal finding in that book is that leaders do not lie very much to other leaders, and they lie mainly to their publics.
Yep.
And you get more lying in democracies than in
Okay.
autocracies.
There you go.
There you go.
I believe that. I really believe that. And I think sometimes you just feel it's a nonstop narrative and deception. And you know, one of the senior people in the Biden administration on another issue, and I don't want to say who and what the context was, but I said, well, you know, have you weighed in on this? And they said no. You know, only the spin guys in the White House have any role in that right now. It's all about narrative, how you pitch it, not what the substance is. This was, you know, is there really that deliberation over that particular issue? And there was very little, actually.
Yeah, it's, you know, when I wrote Why Leaders Lie, and I would go around the country and I would tell people that leaders do not lie much to each other. People found that hard to believe, right? And then when I said that leaders in democracies are especially prone to lying to their publics, people found that hard to believe. But I would just say to you, the reason that people in democracies or the people inside a country are easy to lie to is because those people tend to trust their government. Because after all, it is your government. You expect them to protect you. They're your leaders. So they're primed to be deceived. When you're dealing with foreign leaders, they don't trust each other to begin with. We don't trust Putin. Putin doesn't trust us. And this goes back to 2000 when he took power, right? It's not just now in 2023. So given that there's not much trust to begin with, you really can't get away with lying at the international level like you can at the domestic level.
Oh, that's really something. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and a few others decided they would overthrow the Syrian government in 2011. Typical regime change operation. That's what created the war and the refugees. Did any single European leader say that, explain that to the public? Not one. So then they wonder, why is their popularity so low? Well, if you don't speak up the truth, what do you expect? And so understand that these hegemonic wars of the United States, these are not in Europe's interests. And that's the same with supporting what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not a matter of right or left. It's a matter of what's Europe's interest right now. It is not to have a fulminant Middle East war right now.
So how do you create this miracle? Because even the possible alternative to Biden is Trump or somebody from the Republican. They are in certain aspects even more radical pro-Israeli than the Democrats. How to overcome this tiny problem?
Yeah, so the pressure has to come from inside the United States and from outside. From inside, public opinion absolutely does not accept the administration line on this. This is very clear in opinion survey after opinion survey. So somebody in the White House concerned about Biden's reelection must be reading this and must be understanding this is just purely bad tactics from a U.S. political point of view. That's very important. There's lots of protest in the United States and lots of unhappiness with this. So we're not in any way locked in internally to the politics. It's bad for Biden. It's bad for U.S. interests. It's against public opinion. And so this is one point that I would make. It's not like the United States is rousing support, yes, and it's impossible to turn. It's actually deeply contested and mainly opposed. Though I acknowledge that in Washington, the pro-Israel lobby has always been very powerful. The military-industrial complex is very powerful, and the inertia is also powerful. So I'm not saying it's easy. Now, on the outside, the entire world is basically aligned on this side with one important footnote, which is that a few European countries maybe are not aligned. I don't know what the Austrian government's real position is. Sometimes it's don't side with the U.S., or maybe it really is because of more right-wing view or whatever, side with Israel, but it's very few. The problem in Europe is European politicians stop telling the truth about almost anything years ago because all they want to do is side with the United States. And I think I would just say to European politicians, if you do it, you lose at the polls. There isn't a popular government in Europe right now because it's incredible. This is so much against Europe's own political interests. So I would say, think through this honestly, and then say, it's right. We're not against Israel. We just need to move to a two-state solution. And the United States, come over here, buddy. You know it too. Let's move to a real solution. I'm waiting for European politicians to regain 2 feet on the ground, their head out of the clouds or out of U.S. control, and just state clearly, straightforwardly what is right and also what happens to be in Europe's interest. But by the way, what happens to be in Israel's interest as well, because nothing that's happening is doing anything other than gravely threatening Israel's long-term survival. This messianism, this greater Israel idea, this zealotry of this religious group, this is not saving Israel. This is threatening Israel's survival. So I want European leaders just to think clearly and honestly about this, because that'll also help the United States get to the right place.
I think there is a lot to say about the European leaders. I think the European leaders, there are no leaders, you know it better. And there is another tiny problem. We will have also an election this year in some European countries, but in the European Union for the European Parliament. And the problem is that everybody, according to most of the polls, it's to foresee that the right-wing European nationalistic right-wing parties will win. And the problem is they are even, at least concerning Israel, they are also in the meantime, although many of their parties, if to go back history, you know where they come from. And this is a historic cynicism. I think that these right-wing fascist parties, now they are on side of Israel, which is unbelievable for anybody who knows history and who knows how things happened, that these parties, who are sometimes in internal issues, they are racistic, they are fascistoid right today, but when it comes to Israel, they are supporting the Jewish state.
Yeah, supporting the Jewish state is one thing. Supporting what is called Greater Israel to dominate the Palestinians is so senseless for Israel and for Europe that everybody should take a deep breath and understand that. How many self-wounds does Europe want? How many crises, how many wars does Europe want around it? And I would ask the European leaders, the reason why the right is growing is in part because the so-called center or center-left all was gung-ho with the United States for NATO enlargement and for the war in Ukraine. And of course, it's been a disaster for Europe. It's been a disaster economically for Europe. It's been a disaster from a security point of view for Europe. So it's not even left-right. It's a failure policy that the current European governments have pursued, and they are opening up their way for an opposition to arise. And that's what's happening, in fact. So the reason European politicians, by the way, across the board, you look at the approval ratings in Western Europe right now or in the EU, nobody has any support, basically, except the few that stand up for themselves, like Orban or Fico or a few others. But the ones that are basically just siding with the United States in this useless Ukraine war are all in their 20% approval ratings or 25% approval ratings and so on. So the main point I would say to Europe is, if you go the way, not of supporting Israel, that's one thing, but supporting greater Israel for ethnic cleansing and for this terrible thing, all you're doing is making another prolonged disaster on Europe's borders. And if that's in Europe's interest, boy, please explain it to me.
This is no doubt about it. I think Europe, I think with this policy they follow the last tens of years, I think it's against their own security, economic, even cultural interests. I think this is something which...
I'll give you another example, by the way. The politics of the 2010s was dominated by the Syrian refugees. And anyone that knows even the slightest history should understand that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and a few others decided they would overthrow the Syrian government in 2011, typical regime change operation. That's what created the war and the refugees. Did any single European leader say that? Explain that to the public? Not one. So then they wonder, why is their popularity so low? Well, if you don't speak up the truth, what do you expect? And so understand that these hegemonic wars of the United States, these are not in Europe's interests. And that's the same with supporting what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not a matter of right or left. It's a matter of what's Europe's interest right now. It is not to have a fulminant Middle East war right now. And so European politicians should think about how to diffuse a Mideast-wide war.
You are completely right. I think you convince people like me. Unfortunately, we are not in power. And but coming back to the issue of this interview, I think now there is a peace plan. It's even economically, we didn't even mention it, but which is interesting for me, since you're also long experienced in economy. I think one important but not so much debated proposal is the establishment of a new UN fund. A UN Reconstruction and Sustainable Development Fund, which is interesting, should at least partially funded by reduction of expenses which traditionally have been spent for armament and war.
Outside the UN, across the street from headquarters, is what they call Isaiah's Wall, which is the inscription of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, which says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not make war on other nations, neither will they teach war anymore. I'm paraphrasing, but Isaiah had the idea in the 8th century BCE of the transforming the military to the civilian use. And we're now spending $2.5 trillion a year worldwide on the military. The United States is around 40% of the world's spending. Shocking, because we're 4% of the world's population. What if we take even 10% of that would be $200 billion a year. So $250 billion a year. And so that's the proposal. Create a fund funded by basically agreed cutbacks in armaments. I should mention that Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Populorum Progressio in 1967, had that idea. So I don't want to claim any precedence to this, but I do think it's the right idea. The UN in general does not command much in financial resources. It needs to have a bigger budget to do good things. And one way would be military cutbacks that are rechanneled to sustainable development.
We could continue hours and hours and hours, since many things have been already discussed for many years. But it's interesting that now this plan is here. I think, do you have any ideas how to make it even more popular? Do you intend to present it to other international bodies? And how should this come to reality?
I'm discussing these ideas with UN diplomats all the time. And I've discussed it with Palestinian diplomats and with diplomats from around the Middle East. There's a lot of resonance with this. I personally am continuing to urge an immediate membership of Palestine in the UN as a UN member state. By the way, Palestine is a state recognized by 140 other states, but it is not recognized as a UN member state, only an observer, as you rightly pointed out. So I am continuing my own discussion of this, basically with the U.S. government. They don't talk to me too much, but I try to make my views known publicly by writing and posting articles all the time. And I'm writing to politicians in the U.S. who are quite resistant in general, because their modus operandi for decades has been never show any space at all with Israel. But I'm telling them it's not working. It's not working from any point of view. You need to rethink this. So they have a few days of rethinking before the Congress comes back. The White House cannot be very comfortable. We hear lots of stories about pretty harsh talks between the U.S. and Israel right now. I believe that that's true. One of the U.S. carrier groups has been withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean and is on its way back to the U.S. That is a signal that the U.S. does not want a wider war in the Middle East. I think that's absolutely right. The U.S. is exhausted of war, and an election year, it would be the end of Biden's chances at all. So this is the time for pushing the politics, because it's a case where the right thing to do, the politically expedient thing to do are the same. And so I'm going to continue to push hard on that.
Do you have any hope in, I think you mentioned it and everybody knows it, I think 2/3 of the international states are in favor of this kind of political and economic solution. Unfortunately, they don't have any veto at the UN. But there is something else. There is an increasing number of states working together. I think And the South African move to the International Court is interesting because South Africa, on the other side, is one of the leading member states of this newly established group, the BRICS group. And they have even already established a kind of new banking system, financing system. Do you have any indications or ideas that from this side, more than just political statements will come to support your suggestions?
Well, the BRICS countries, all of them, are on the same side that I've been advocating. China, Russia, South Africa, India has expressed also some clarity on this. Brazil, certainly. And now you have new BRIC states that have just joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It's a powerful group. They're all on this side. Actually, it's interesting for me, the fact that Iran is now a BRICS member is actually going to moderate Iran, make it part of what could be a BRICS-wide consensus on a good solution. So this matters because the U.S. also looks out and says, our diplomacy, we're isolated, whereas China's and Russia's diplomacy is growing in the region. This cannot make anyone happy. And we know that in the U.S. State Department, there's a lot of unhappiness about the U.S. administration policy. We don't hear all the details, but it boils over every few weeks. And so we hear about the protests coming from inside the professional diplomatic service of the United States as well. So I wouldn't give up in any way on a political change where the United States one day says, we need to move forward to a real solution here. This is where I think it's very appropriate and timely to think straight. And if the European leaders are too afraid to say it in public, they should be saying it. They should be saying it in private to their American counterparts.
They should, yeah. So I think it's time. I think we exceeded a little bit our usual limit. So thank you very much, Professor Sachs. I think it was very interesting. It's important, and I think we should really invest more and more time to publish these ideas, and maybe even outside the usual normal circles we have in New York, in Brussels, because the world is much bigger and in the long run more or less more powerful than the world which runs the business till now, but it will come to an end. And the Palestinian-Israeli issue could be, we forgot something, because the Palestinian issue, what is it in history? It's a colonial problem. It's one of the last unsolved colonial problems, and it's more than 100 years after formally colonialism was ended. It's time to deal with the remaining rests, and Israel-Palestine is one, and this should be one of our ambitions to
1 year ago that the first good book about this, Limits to Growth, was written and made clear that there was a real problem. And we've not finished solving that problem. But let me stipulate the following, just like I did for the first one. There's nothing fundamental about these environmental challenges that is beyond our solution, even with our current knowledge base. In other words, we already in 2023 have the range of technical solutions to 90% of the greenhouse gases, not 100%. We definitely don't face a choice between food and nature. We face a choice between destructive and non-destructive forms of food production. That's a very different choice. I haven't found in 40 years of my work on this a fundamental barrier to economic well-being and environmental sustainability. So I'm not in the degrowth school of thought, which says that what we really need is to reverse economic development. Not all economic development is good for human well-being. That's a different matter. But I'm not of the school of thought that says we've created a kind of society that is completely inconsistent with our environmental necessities or our environmental well-being or health. What we have is a very flawed economic system, legal system, regulatory system, incentive structure, so that we adopt or continue with technologies that are very ill-advised and do lots of stupid things because it's possible to make money off of those stupid things, rather than do the things that we should be doing. And I've not seen in all of my experience any calculations that show me that that doing the right things is beyond our reach, beyond our budget, beyond our economic means. For example, all of the estimates about the energy transformation to a zero carbon energy system suggest that it's 1 or 2% of world output that is needed to make that change. That's really strange. It's not that it's 50% of world output that's needed. It's not that this is cataclysmically expensive and we're just doomed as if an asteroid were coming to hit the planet and we have nothing to do. No, we have clear, very, very clear things to do. Sometimes we have too many possible things to do, so we don't know which one to take, so we're paralyzed. Should we do wind or solar or nuclear or this? I don't know. We won't do anything right now. We're making money with what we're doing. So we're paralyzed, or we know what to do, but there are strong vested interests saying don't do it because I'm making too much money in the short term doing the destructive things, or it just is complicated and hasn't been thought out properly because this is something absolutely new. It was rather straightforward to build a coal plant, but it's not so straightforward perhaps to build offshore wind or solar fields or something else because of storage or other issues. So there are just complexities. But that's the second big category of challenge that we face, which is this economic environmental collision course, which again needs analysis and then needs to ask, how deep is the problem? And for me, and how solvable is the problem? So the climate crisis is very deep, but it's also rather solvable. And there are some puzzles, definitely. What should big ocean tankers run on? Should it be hydrogen fuel cells? Should it be ammonia? Should it be hydrogen combustion? I'm not an engineer. I've heard the arguments from the engineers. I want them to fight it out. I want them to try different approaches, but clearly we should be trying these technology lines. The third big challenge, which is a challenge of time immemorial, is that we seem to have a very hard time to stop killing each other. So war becomes ever more dangerous because the weapons become ever more destructive. And now we're technologically so smart that we figured out how to destroy the whole humanity. Damn it. If we weren't so smart, we wouldn't have this trouble. But a few geniuses figured out you could make nuclear fission work to make a bomb. By the way, there were probably 50 people in the world that understood that. And they figured it out, and then they gave it to a world of idiots. So we have a lot of dumb people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, and they were made by a few geniuses. That's our problem. So this is our third issue, which is how to stay peaceful and cooperative. To my mind, these are the three big issues that we face, which is how to be fair and decent to people who are suffering, how to make sure that we're not self-destructive because our economic system is actually a complicated set of incentives that doesn't get things right, and there's no magic in how we have organized our economic life to handle issues like greenhouse gases, which weren't in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and are not part of the things that a free market can solve, and so forth. And the third is this interminable problem that if you read human history, we've been fighting with each other most of the time, but there are also glimmers of hope that there are long periods of peace, and we also have institutions for peace just like we have institutions for war. One of the things that makes me quite optimistic about China's rise is that China has been much more peaceful in its history than just about any other region of the world. And the amount of interstate war of China over the last 2,000 years is actually quite low. It's basically been wars of pastoralists coming from the north and sedentary farmers trying to fight them off. And that's been most of China's wars for 2,000 years. If you look at Europe's wars, it was just kill each other across the divide for 1,000 years, nonstop. So China at least has a peaceful tradition, and I think it fits actually with this idea of harmonious society, with the idea of global civilizations and so forth. I'm quite an optimist, I have to say, about that, because I think it actually there's a deep rootedness. So that's all we have to do. End poverty, protect the environment, stop killing with each other. All right? So, thank you. No, okay. So what do we do? To my mind, the basic thing is we should think hard about each of those things and then come up with plans. That's the most basic idea. That sounds so dumb. Why am I saying that after 40 years? Don't I have anything more intelligent to say? And the thing is that the way that our social systems work is not to think and then solve these things. And that's very interesting. Our economic system is designed around a different principle, which is let people do what they want, get rich, go find your job, go buy what you want, but not solve problems. So in economic land, it's not oriented towards solving problems. It's oriented towards doing your thing. Businesses are supposed to go make profits, and we're supposed to be good consumers, and we're supposed to be smart in the job that we pursue. But at least in market economics, which became the dominant ideology of the Anglo-Saxon world and then the world, it isn't to solve problems, it's go do your thing. So don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the economic sphere or from the business community. It's not their job. Their job is to run a business. It's to make money. So that's problem number one, that we don't think in the economic sphere about end goals. We're supposed to just do our thing. And then politicians. In most politics, it's not about solving problems. It's about maintaining power. And that's even the goal. And you have experts on maintaining power. All the politicians have little Machiavellis around them, handing them, this is what you need to do to stay in power. And that's your goal. And so politics, at least in my country, has very little to do with any goals. I don't know what any American goals are. We have no goals. We have some heroes, our founding fathers. We love the Constitution. We like the July 4th Independence Day. But we have no goals. And even when I hear Dr. Zhao talk about China's goals, you could not have that in the United States, stating those goals. Because that's socialism. You're not allowed to have goals. So politics is not oriented towards solving problems, really. It's management of power, competition for power, holding on to power, benefiting from power. And so we don't see from our governments most of the time these big goals and how to solve them. I really think China's been different in this period, the last 40 years, from most other governments. And I think the success is a result of that, actually, that it's really, and why? Well, I think this is a very interesting question, but a few countries at a few times have very clear goals. Maybe because of survival, maybe because of their past history, maybe because they have a successful neighbor, so they want to imitate the success. Maybe, like in Singapore, because a genius came, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had a very, very clear idea. And really, Singapore, it is a case of a very clear, brilliant thinker who just guided things for quite a while, like Plato's philosopher king. But most of the time, this is not how politics is. So we don't see a lot of this problem solving coming from governments. And the third thing is, in my country, which became the most powerful country in the world for the last 75 years militarily, they really think that fighting wars is a big part of what governance is about. They're crazy and dangerous and could get us all killed. So that third category of just peaceful cooperation does not come easily. Every day we read something hateful about China in the American newspapers now. Every single day. I just read today, China has the Global Civilizations Initiative. Wonderful. You talked about it. Today I just read, this is terrible. This is, China's out to take over the world through this. Now, honestly, this is a mindset that is very, very deep, probably ingrained evolutionarily in us also, because there probably was a time when whoever could control the next water hole survived, and whoever didn't survive, and it was us or them. And that's not how the world is right now. It's not us or them. We don't need to take over any other place to have well-being, period. There's no crisis of living room. There is only the crisis of understanding, don't kill the other side. Okay, so what do we do? Again, just to conclude, we need to think clearly. Excuse me. That's a technical term about American politics. So we need really to put serious ideas forward in detail. And that's the purpose of what we're after. And two specific pathways that we're really focusing on right now is one is the energy transition, because there's only a quarter century and an energy system's really complicated. You have to have a power grid. We have to convert all the vehicles to electric or to hydrogen or to some other non-emitting source. The building sector has to be far more efficient. Industry emits a lot of greenhouse gases. Deforestation. In other words, all of the getting to net zero is quite a complicated challenge with lots of moving parts, and it's a lot of money. Not more than an energy system costs, but an energy system is trillions of dollars a year, and so it's worth getting right. So that's the first of the pathways. And the second is the land use and ocean use, because we're really so close to destroying everything irreversibly. When the species is lost, it's never coming back. And when the ecosystems are degraded, many of them never return. And if we pass climate thresholds, we're just going to spend the next century in disaster of calamitous sea level rises, storms, heat waves, and so on. So we're very close to that. So those are the two main pathways that we are really focusing on: the biological and its association with food production and with other agricultural production. And for this region, that's central, because this is a biodiversity Garden of Eden, and also a biodiversity threatened region intensively. All this beauty, and it's being torn down. And it can happen so fast because economies are very, very large right now, and demands. China could deforest this country just by its demands for tropical hardwoods without a problem, unless you take care. So those are the two areas that we really want to focus on. And the final point that I want to say is, again, about this third category of cooperation. It happens that when you look technically at an energy program or at an ecosystem program, no country can do this by itself. Nothing can be done other than at the local level, but plans need to be transnational without question. So there's a lot of local action, but they have to be part of a broader framework. And that's why this is an ASEAN workshop, because ASEAN countries are not only together on the map and not only physical neighbors, but have work to do together, because ASEAN countries cannot achieve their goals without working together. And so we need to do this at a transnational planning level. That's hard, because there are no elected transnational officials anywhere. All transnational organizations are weak, because none of them has an army. None of them has political leaders. We're organized at the national level in the world. That's where the physical force lies. And that's where the politics generally lies. And yet we have global and regional problems that need addressing urgently. The Mekong is not going to be saved one country at a time. It's going to be saved by China, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam working together. Without question, there's no way to do that one country at a time. It's got to be done in the watershed. The energy system for Malaysia absolutely needs to be integrated with the rest of the region. And those regional institutions are weak politically and organizationally, and they need to be strengthened considerably. And then the question of what region is the right region for this. We're dealing with ASEAN because it's a crucial, established regional entity. But I said yesterday, and I'll say it again, I think for the energy sector, RCEP is even more appropriate. That's adding in ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The United States would have a fit, by the way. I'll be done in 1 minute. The US would have a fit. You're cooperating with China? Well, my strong advice to you is cooperate with China closely. And my strong advice to Australia is don't build a submarine base, cooperate with China. And let's not waste money on nuclear submarines right now and raise the tension more. So my own advice is that broader group, and I hope India joins that group, and then we've got a lot of the world together in a way that could actually solve the problems. So sorry for the long rambling, except I believe that all of these problems are solvable. I believe that universities have a unique and extremely important role to play in this, because this is what we should be doing: training, teaching, educating, researching, policy analysis, and really trying to make politics work the way that it should, which is for the common good. Thank you. Because for Hobbes, there was no longer a cultivation of virtue, but rather each individual with insatiable desires. So Hobbes's model of human nature is that it is simply unbounded desire. It can't be taught to moderate desire. It can't be cultivated for virtue. It is individualistic and it is insatiable. And so Hobbes said, unless there is an overarching power, people will kill each other. And so we need a Leviathan, he said, to stop human nature from committing non-stop violence. It was a very pessimistic view of human nature, but notice the main point is no longer was there any idea of developing virtue. That was deemed to be impossible. Instead, one needed institutions to reflect harsh reality. This is the flip of philosophy. It's no longer about cultivating the good. It is about controlling the bad. Then interestingly and importantly, this was amplified at the beginning of the 18th century, first by a very influential public intellectual, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay in London called The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, the most aggressive bees win, but they make the hive powerful and great. And if you try to control the avarice or the vice or the aggression of the bees, the hive actually dies. So this was now a philosophy of empire, that power seeking was good because it would make the society powerful and wealthy and able to dominate over the other bees. So it was taking Hobbes and adding another element. One beehive taking dominance over others. And clearly this was a philosophy that appealed to the emerging British Empire. Then came Adam Smith 6 decades later in 1776, and he said, in agreement with Hobbes and in agreement with Mandeville, that human nature is individualistic, tastes are unbounded, desire is a great motivator, but market forces will tame all of that, because market forces will force a kind of competition that will lead to a socially beneficent outcome. The point is, the Anglo-Saxon philosophy broke free of more than 1,800 years of Western tradition. The Western tradition from Aristotle and Christianity was a tradition of the common good, virtue, and care for the poor. With the rise of the British Empire, the philosophy became the benefits of power as a philosophy. And then even the idea that this would lead to, quote, the common good. But there are two more steps that are important to state. The poor became an enemy because now they were a drag on society. So John Locke, one of our most esteemed philosophers, wanted very harsh treatment for the poor so that they would not be burdens on society. And then came Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote after Adam Smith, one generation later in 1798. And he proposed something even darker, which is that those hives, those different societies, are actually in competition for survival with each other, because there are more people produced than can be supported. And so life is a battle for survival, and trying to help the poor is inevitably to fail, because there will just be more poor people. That was his iron law of population. And that led in the next step. Darwin took that idea brilliantly from a scientific point of view to understand natural selection. But the later 19th century philosophers took that idea as a struggle across nations, and that now nations or peoples or races were in the struggle for survival. And this became known as social Darwinism. And the idea was, not only should there be no beneficence, if you help your own poor, you will weaken your society compared to others, and indeed you're in a struggle for survival. And this gave rise to the worst crimes of history, because Nazism actually, as a philosophy, which it was based on social Darwinist pseudoscience. And this idea, the German people will survive or the Slavic people will survive. And so this is a war even to extermination. Now, this kind of idea led to the worst cruelties, but we are still in a mindset in the Western world where it is competition and struggle that is the absolute underpinning of society. When I studied economics, I was taught about perfect competition. I was never taught even 1 minute about perfect cooperation. The idea doesn't even exist in economics. It's not even developed in one paper that I know of. because the idea of cooperation as a norm doesn't exist. It happened, this notion of letting greed motivate action perhaps did generate the spirit of innovation to some extent. But the way that it was championed and taught, of course, led to the worst excesses. So the world became rich, and those who were rich became devoid of benevolence and compassion. And a terrible writer in the United States who became quite popular, Ayn Rand, a kind of popular philosopher among young people and among many politicians, wrote a famous essay about the virtues of selfishness. So selfishness became the virtue, actually. That's the literal title of an essay. It's unbelievable, and she is championed by many still. These novels are unbearable to read, but they are part of our philosophy. So I went on too long, I know, because the sign told me to stop 5 minutes ago. But so that's not very benevolent of me. But let me say the following. I believe we've had a deviation from the right path in Western civilization. There are roots of Western culture that we can really use to find a path of virtue and politics that is ethical. But the Anglo-Saxon version deeply lost this tradition. And there are many fascinating reasons for this, but it was mainly the rise of power of the British Empire, which was in many ways an extremely nasty empire. And the United States learned everything it knows from the British Empire because it aims to be the continuation of the British Empire after World War II. And this is what needs to end, a world that can return to the common ethical principles of virtue. Now, let me just conclude by saying I am hopeful that this can actually happen. And I think you at the table need to help lead that. And we need to help explain these things. And when President Xi Jinping launched last year the Global Civilizations Initiative, I think that this is actually an important opening that is very positive, because China has said we should go back to our roots of culture to find a way forward, which I very much subscribe to. And the GCI, or Global Civilizations Initiative, is an invitation across civilizational wisdom. And I hosted a meeting in Athens last month, co-hosted with the Academy of Athens, a Aristotle-Confucius symposium on ancient wisdom for modern challenges that brought together Chinese and Western philosophers. We didn't have Buddha properly at the table except one very distinguished Buddhist thinker from Cambodia, but we need more of that. At the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would have a second symposium. This time, I hope it is the Aristotle-Buddha-Confucius Symposium in Shufu, in Shandong province in July. I hope we could participate together in that. We will be back for that. Many philosophers are interested in that. I will be in Shufu in next month for the Nishan Forum, which is also a philosophical forum, but the Shandong government has asked to host the follow-up meeting of the Aristotle, Buddha, Confucius symposium. And I believe that this idea of East and West deep philosophical traditions, finding the deep humanity that is common across them, is extremely important and powerful and can really contribute to an understanding which right now doesn't exist. And I think the failings of this understanding are overwhelmingly on the Western side, if I may say so, because we are steeped in a philosophy of competition and even war. And this mindset is taken as given, but it is actually a recent phenomenon. It is an imperial phenomenon, and it needs to be put aside. So I believe that this actually can be done. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because I want to talk about net zero by 2050. And first to say how much I admire what Dr. Shaw proposed, and is the book in English also, or in Chinese? Okay, we're going to have to get me an English translation somehow, if we can, but I'm very eager also to read your forthcoming paper. Let me add a couple of things that I think are central, but I think they're already exactly in your climate club idea. It is not possible to reach net zero one country at a time, least of all for an island. We need an interconnected energy system, region by region, because if you are tapping renewable energy, it's intermittent. So it's sunny here or windy here. This needs interconnection. And East Asia should be interconnected in a common grid. There is a mainland China program called GuideCo, Cooperation Organization, that is the China State Grid engineers who are doing analytical work on interconnecting regional grids for Africa, for South America, for North America, for Europe, and for Asia. This is very important work. Taiwan should be connected to the mainland in a power grid. And the mainland should be connected with Mongolia, and it should be connected with the ASEAN countries, and with submarine system. It would be region, the economic powerhouse of the world, rather than a battleground, because this region has everything if it works together. And it could lose everything if it views the region as a battleground. I think everyone in this region can understand this. The only one that does not is my country, actually. But the U.S. needs to be told, let us solve our problems. We know how to discuss. Don't meddle, because you will make a mess. This is actually the truth. This is true about Japan. It's true. of zero carbon energy and all the cooperation that would the regional cooperation, the regional structure, and pose and probably roadmaps that show the physical interconnectedness, what technologies, where, as I've been saying, opposite of a plan. It's 80% fossil fuel. What plan is that? Nothing. Please, don't encourage them. So show fantastic work. Sonia and I were just in Beijing with them a couple of days ago. We'll come back for a meeting that they're hosting on September 26th for a worldwide meeting on energy interconnections. I think that this is really absolutely at the core. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's absolutely the way forward. And in that polycentric world, there's a concept which I find very useful. It's a concept adopted by the European Union, but a concept that actually started with the Roman Catholic Church, and that is the concept of subsidiarity, which is that we need governance at all levels. So we need global governance, regional governance, national governance, local governance. You put each problem at the lowest level possible, closest to the people, where it can be solved, but not below the level at which it can be solved. So the power grid cannot be solved at the national level. It must be solved at the regional level. The targets for decarbonization must be solved at the global level, and so forth. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we have this multiple levels. We have global governance. We have a global government that can do certain things and not other things. We have regional government. We have national government. We have local